Thank you, Diane, and thank you all so much. She's right. This landscape is like some surreal vision of what Earth should look like. Balloons and kids smiling. I keep thinking that there's a little bit of a girls' club thing going on here tonight, at least around my table. Diane, whom I've known and admired for so long, and Bonnie Stone, who I've worked with before, Christine Quinn and Casey Jennings and Martha Nelson, an old friend. We didn't look like this morning when we ran into each other in Riverside Park, did we, Martha? We were both in our sweats then. And it occurred to me, taking the long view, that so many of us, almost all of us in this room, have lived through a time of incredible challenge for women, in which we've been trying to be both our mothers and our fathers simultaneously. But I feel as though it's been the very best time to live, that those of us of a certain age got it all, like a time-lapse photograph, branch to bud to blossom in a single generation. We women in America started with a world of virtually no options, then moved on to that time in which every bit of progress seemed like a battle, in which valedictorians at good colleges who happened to be female were still assumed to be seeking work they would pursue until they got engaged or got pregnant. And then suddenly, almost overnight, we could be anywhere, do anything, except for Pope and President. And no woman really wants that first job anyway. And we will sooner rather than later get the second. It's been like the Industrial Revolution without sweatshops, or the American Revolution without guns. Victory was ours, but not without some suffering. I remember the day a woman said to me, "Oh, you poor girls with all your choices." And I knew exactly what she meant. There have been times when it really required 2 or 3 people to be a reasonably competent version of me, but I'm not complaining. The greatest social tsunami of our lifetime, the women's movement, was part fearsome political force, part personal support group. It was hated, and it was feared, and it still is, and it changed the world completely. So that every year on her birthday, I send Gloria Steinem an email that says, "Thank you for my life." With all of the technological changes of the last half-century, it's the women's movement that has provided the greatest change in the ways in which we live now. My daughter once asked me if a man could be Secretary of State. After all, during her youth, the position had been occupied by Madeleine Albright, Condoleezza Rice, and Hillary Clinton, and she thought Colin Powell was kind of a fluke. But progress always brings with it an element of danger, an element of backlash, which we've all seen recently, but amnesia too. For years, I thought of myself as a woman who had burst free of the circle of Avon Lady, Tupperware Party, and Fuller Brush Man that my mother inhabited, in which she spent years in maternity smocks and seemed to iron incessantly. I have never owned an iron, and that is not an accident. The combination of hot metal and a damp dress shirt seemed to me to be a sentence to a life of nothing much. Sometimes I think that my entire generation of women adopted for a time that childlike point of view. that the women who came before us did things that were beneath notice. Luckily, we're grown up enough to understand how stupid that was, what heroines they all were, and how we risked throwing out the babies with the bathwater, sometimes quite literally, as we were chasing a fair deal. We're at the tail end of a dialectic now that started with a thesis, the thesis of woman as housewife and homemaker. The antithesis, the opposite, was the woman warrior. And the synthesis, what we hand down to our children, is some from column A and some from column B. And it's recognizing that there were aspects of our mothers' lives that were invaluable and that we should never have jettisoned at all. When we fought for equal pay for equal work, for jobs with an upward trajectory and public respect, we too often turned our backs on the kind of volunteerism that had given shape to the lives of women before us. But many of us found, as we mounted that ladder, that we missed that sense of doing well by doing good, that sense of opening our arms to other women, doing work that served the world as well as serving ourselves. Those powerful impulses to give back may have been dormant within us for a time, but they never died. And they bring us here tonight to support this extraordinary organization, which for so long has provided those things that we take for granted: a roof, shelter, support for women who are just like us, women who are daughters and mothers and job seekers and hard workers and dreamers, and children who we saw tonight could well be ours, children who, standing at this podium tonight, we would have been proud to call ours. You know, it occurs to me that those of us who live in New York City have a unique blessing. We don't live like many of our friends in the suburbs with geographic apartheid. Walk up Park Avenue from 86th to 116th Street and you pass from one New York into another. In the doorways of the churches on Fifth Avenue at Christmas time, we see the men who have made cocoons of blankets and whose holiday dinner will be in a church basement if they get one at all. In the waiting rooms at the great hospitals, we watch women with 3 young kids and a frown between their brows, even when they have barely breached their 20s. One morning some years ago, we had a snow day in New York City, which, as all of the parents out there know, is awfully rare. And as my 3 happy campers slept, I went out in my boots and parka to get milk from the corner bodega. One of the women there was wiping tears from her face with a paper napkin. And her younger colleague told me in whispers that that woman too had 3 children, and that usually they got breakfast and lunch free at school. And she was worried about having enough food in the house to feed them on that snow day. You can say you don't care, but you can't say you don't know in this city. Astonishing prosperity is all around us. So is astonishing need. And what does it mean if we have the wherewithal to write best-selling books, make partner at law firms, perform neurosurgery, teach college courses, anchor the evening news, and yet wear blinders to those who, for whatever reason, haven't shared in our prosperity? What if that women's movement only elevated the existences of people who were already privileged and lucky, women not in need? What if the only children we cared for were our own? How sad that would be. During the course of this coming presidential election, we are going, I'm sure, to hear a great deal about American exceptionalism. That feeling about ourselves that's the equivalent of the big foam rubber hand with the finger that shows that we're number 1, that we're the best. But the truth is, there is no such thing as American exceptionalism. there are only Americans who may or may not choose to be exceptional day by day. We can only hope that we all will, that all of us will feel called by our religious or moral traditions not to pass harsh judgment on others, but to be exceptionally generous to them. The better angels of our nature, another American president once called this, and we need to call upon those angels all we can. Because of the changes in the lives of women during our formative years, we grew up thinking of ourselves sometimes as exceptional. The good news is that we outgrew some of this, one of the clearest benefits of getting older. It's true my mother fed her babies food from jars while I made my own. It's also true that she didn't have a sitter 5 days a week, and that she couldn't call for Thai takeout when all of us were clamoring for dinner, takeout being one of the unexpected linchpins of the women's movement in our time. When the doors busted open, the doors to medical and law schools, lots of smart women my age were contemptuous of what had been traditional female jobs. Medicine meant being a doctor. Education meant being a professor. We wanted to have a secretary, not be one. Eventually, we learned that that was short-sighted. The most pivotal figure in a birthing room is the labor and delivery nurse. Our children spent more time with their teachers on any given day than they did with us. And social workers? Well, there isn't enough money in the world to pay social workers what they're worth. We're part of the generation that said we wanted to change the world, and we did. We insisted we wanted more than our mothers had, and we got it. We let the 40-hour work week morph into the 60-hour work week and even the 80-hour work week. And in between those hours at the desk, we had those hours in the kitchen and the car, overseeing homework, making the rounds of the athletic fields. For those of us who feared as girls that our lives would be empty and boring, the crazed timpani of our existences at least meant that we were not in some domestic cul-de-sac. But I'm not sure if we're being honest, we would consider our alternative entirely ideal. I've begun to develop a certain comfort level with criticisms of those much younger women who want to make a different sort of life for themselves. If their experience of their exhausted, insomniac, stressed out elders makes them decide they prefer not to go straight from the classroom to the cubicle to the coffin, it doesn't necessarily mean they're ungrateful for what we've done. Maybe it just means that they're sane. After all, progress is always relative. Sometimes it's not even real. I once heard Claudia Kennedy, who at the time was the only 3-star female general in the Army, talk about the question of critical mass, of how many members of any group you need inside the tent to speak up, to speak out, to make change, to raise hell. But maybe there's a critical mass for women at which it seems as though things are dandy when dandy is still a ways off. I mean, is it 14 women in the Senate? Is it 3 women on the Supreme Court? It amazes me how few women are required on a corporate board to satisfy the suits that they've done the woman thing. I remember a few years ago there was a report from the White House Project that showed that there was a lid on big jobs for women, a lid set at roughly 20%. Half the population, and on average only 20% of the country's leaders in business, in journalism, in law, in politics. In many cases, women's participation had been stuck at that 20% level for years while other countries zoomed ahead. The United States has dropped down the world's ladder of female political representation behind such countries as Iraq and North Korea. At big law firms, one study showed that women were a measly 12% of the partners in 1993. 20 years later, That number was up to a whopping 18%. I hate those statistics, but those of us who don the suit and heels must remember that there is something worse than the paltry number of female CEOs in the Fortune 500. The poverty rate in New York City is almost exactly the same as the percentage of women leaders in business. In one case, far too low, in the other, far too high. The vast majority of the people living in poverty are children. Some of us have spent more on a single pair of shoes than a family of 4 below the poverty line lives on for a week. Maybe we're wearing those shoes right this minute. Don't feel guilty. We can do the shoes and we can do the right thing, both at the same time. We can help because we always have. Even in our brave new world of equal opportunity, women have done much, much more than their fair share. Either the woman of the house or the woman they hired to be their surrogate there. I hope that all changes for my children. I'm happy that they were spared the decades of lousy contraception and forced pregnancies, spared the quotas at professional schools. I'm happy they live in a world in which it is regularly acknowledged that a man who hits his wife is a bully and a weakling, and a man who takes care of his own children is not babysitting, and a man who changes diapers is not entitled to be treated as though he's just invented fire. So much seems normative for our kids: the stay-at-home dad next door, the woman presidential candidate, the mother who does not defer, the father who doesn't insist on the last word. It's not that all the problems of gender disparity have been solved. Far from it. There are different problems now, issues of nuance and unspoken assumptions instead of the blunt club of bigotry. There's still plenty to be done for their world to be truly egalitarian. But I will have utterly failed in my duty to them if they think that egalitarian means only the right of women to rise to the top. It also means the right of women to rise to the middle, the right of families to live with dignity and care, the right of children to have full stomachs, and a decent place to sleep. Those of us who have prospered over the last few decades rose on the shoulders of women who went before us. And because of that, our mantra became, rise up, reach down. In my work, I believed I had the obligation to bring other women along, as reporters, as editors, as columnists. But there's a far broader application of those words, and it behooves us to remember it tonight. As we raise up our own families, we have to help raise those a few subway stops to the north or the east. As we raise our own standard of living, we must be generous and conscious of those who are struggling. Just because we women work for salary now doesn't relieve us from the responsibility to work for good as well. Rise up, reach down. Look at everything we've done. We can do that for our sisters. Thank you very much.